Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and down here on the floor you see a tub with no label on it. That's a new tub that I just built. It's awaiting the introduction of worms, and hopefully today we're going to be able to round up some worms out of a couple of my other bins to get that worm bin started, and then it'll get a label with today's date, and that'll be a new tub. And I'll have one more worm composting bin in my collection here. The tubs that I'm looking to get worms out of are the one right here, and you can see on the far edge there's a feeding zone which was set up for the purposes of trying to get the worms to move out of the finished compost over to get into the new food, into the new bedding, abandoning the finished castings so that it can get harvested. And I've got this other tub up here, slightly different. I treat this as a finishing tub, and that's mainly because the worms that I'm trying to lure into this feeding zone here are worms that I'm assuming were hatched out of their cocoons that were left in those finished castings. So this tub has been operating this way for 83 days now, with what I had treated as finished castings, with the knowledge that there were cocoons yet to hatch and baby worms yet to be relocated out of the castings and moved into other active bins. And then at that point I would consider that as finished castings. Whereas in this one, the worms that I'm trying to relocate into the feeding zone are mature worms, worms that have actively been working this compost. And after that evacuation occurs, I would still treat this as a tub full of not only finished castings, but also a bunch of worm cocoons that would still need time to hatch and to also be lured and migrated out of the material. And I'm still questioning whether or not I'm going to continue this concept of active tubs versus finishing tubs. I don't know. I'm still debating whether I like that idea or not. To me it seems like almost like a false finish here to say that this is really done, but it's not done because there's still baby worms that have to hatch and get moved out as well. So I'm questioning whether I'm going to continue this concept of finishing tubs or not. But the jury is still out on that. I'll decide later. For now, we're going to be trying to move worms out of these two tubs to launch off a new bin. So let's get to work. So we're going to start here with what I'm referring to as my finishing tub. This tub has been operating in this finishing mode, if you want to call it that, for 83 days now. And during that time, I've actually made almost a dozen attempts at luring and baiting worms out of this material to keep moving them out and moving them over into different bins. And each time I do, I always check to see how the material is coming along, to see if it in fact has been depopulated yet. So I think we're going to start with that this time. We're going to just check through this material to see how the depopulation of the material is progressing. The longer you wait, the less and less food remains in the material, and the less and less moisture remains in the material as it evaporates away. Both of those conditions contributing to the material becoming less and less hospitable for the worms, hopefully spurring on their movement out of the material in search of a more comfortable place to live. So as I stir the material around, I'm not only looking for worms to see how the migration is progressing, I'm also attempting to stir the more damp material up off the bottom and take some of this more dry material off the surface that's been given time to air out and move it down into the contents of the bin, so that hopefully the moisture sort of equalizes, and then we end up with sort of an averaged moisture level that we can judge the overall batch of material on to see if we like the dryness or if we think that it needs a little bit more time to air out and dry more. I would have to say that the initial impression that I'm getting here is that, number one, I am seeing baby worms. I think I saw a couple slightly larger, more mature worms too while I was moving stuff around here, but the majority of the worms that I think I saw were somewhat smaller baby worms, but definitely not too many. Maybe if I do spot one or two, maybe it would make good sense for me to just move them right over to where they belong, which is over in the feeding zone. But I'll also have to make a judgment call as to whether or not I think I've successfully rounded up the majority of them, and that I can really consider this material as done, or if I'd like to maybe give this material a little bit more time to go to allow for the worms to make their way out on their own. So it does seem like with any given stir, I am locating a couple worms here and there. And I do feel like I'm locating a fair number of cocoons too as I go. When it comes to worm cocoons, they're fairly light in color when they're originally deposited into the worm bin. And as they get closer and closer to the point where they're going to hatch, they grow darker and darker in color. And the example that I have in my hand is one of a very, very dark colored cocoon. And I think that tells me that there is still unhatched cocoons throughout this material, because that was not the only one that I saw. I keep spotting them as I go. Here we got a pretty good sized adult worm who must have probably come over into the bin or was hatched quite some time ago, because it's pretty good in size compared to what we've been seeing in general. But that is the exception as far as I can tell. The material, as I start to stir the more dry stuff down into it and bring the more damp stuff up to the surface and start combining them, the material does feel pretty nice and flaky. It does seem to crumble pretty readily, but maybe not quite as much as one would hope if they were going to, for example, run this material through a sifter. It does seem like it could stand to spend a little bit more time airing out and drying. So I think between us still having itsy bitsy little tiny worms still in the bin needing time to migrate out, as well as cocoons that have yet to hatch, and last but not least, material that still needs time to air out, I think we're probably going to want to let this go a little bit longer so that the worms that are in here have time to make their way out over into the feeding zone, which we will rebuild so that it can continue. So I think we've managed to stir this material up pretty nicely, even relocating some worms as we encounter them, put them over into the feeding zone, and I've even been snatching up the cocoons I see as I encounter them to also migrate them into the new home. But you can just go on here forever trying to pick off these little baby worms and manually put them over into the feeding zone. But some of them are so small, you can tell that they were just very recently hatched. I mean, tiny, tiny worms. I'm questioning whether or not the camera's even going to be able to spot them. And a lot of times they're just covered with castings. And if the castings material were a little bit drier, it would flake away much more readily. So besides wanting to give the cocoons time to hatch and the worms that come out of them time to move out of the castings, the other thing we're looking for here is some more time for this material to continue drying. So I think we've made a decision here that tells us this material is going to sit for a little while longer, but luckily we've managed to stir it up a little bit and get some of the more damp stuff up to the surface to give it a chance to dry, and move some of the more dry stuff down into the material to help equalize the moisture level throughout the bin. But the material is really nice, and at some point, if you really decided that you needed it and you wanted to use it as is and that it was going to go out into the garden today, then that would be just as fine as well. There'd be really no reason not to. The only thing that would happen is that you'd lose that opportunity to keep those last few remaining baby worms in your wormery, and they'd end up in your garden, which is almost just as good. And it's incredible how many cocoons I'm seeing. I would have thought that after 83 days in this tub that these cocoons would have had ample time to hatch. And based on their color being as dark as they are, it tells me that they're probably pretty close to hatching, but for whatever reason they have not yet hatched. So I'm just moving them along with the worms when we get to relocating them. But I can see that there's still the potential for many, many more worms to emerge out of these cocoons that I'm seeing throughout the material. I'm going to use a piece of paper here to cover up these castings. Let's turn it over, put the more soiled side down. And onto the cleaner side, we're going to put this little plastic tub so that we can use it as a temporary holding pen until we get around to releasing the worms. So now I'm not going to pull out all of this material. I think a lot of this material can just go right back in here so that we can rebuild the feeding zone. So I'll try to keep it separate. And when we reset, we'll simply use it to rebuild the feeding zone over here. Now I'm even seeing remnants of the previous feedings here. Here we've got a banana peel, which is definitely getting worked down pretty nicely. And it's a little bit surprising that I'm not seeing worms all over it. And it might be because as you go down a little bit deeper, you can see the material is a lot more damp down low. Chances are that that's really where we're going to end up seeing the majority of the worms that have made their way over into this feeding zone. So I think we've scooped out enough of the material that we're going to try to preserve in here and reuse. I think at this point we're just going to look to get the remainder of the material in here out, along with the baby worms that occupy it. And it is pretty gooey and mushy, and that's because it was covered with plastic, and any moisture kicking off of the food items and stuff is just recirculating and hopefully making it into a nice tempting place for the worms to be. So let's see what else we can scoop out of here as part of our relocation. Here too, more material with more worms in it, mostly little baby worms, couple slightly larger worms I see. Like I said before, those larger worms are typically the exception. Just want to make sure none of these little baby worms squirm away from the nice damp pile, because dryness is not their friend. So this makes me wonder if I'm moving mostly castings at this point. If so, I'll just leave those behind. Those bits of castings. I wonder how this stuff right out here on the edge looks. Since we're rebuilding, I'm not going to go nuts trying to relocate any worms that I see. We can see some worms that were attempting to make their way over to where they sense the food supply, but just haven't quite made it yet. What we'll do is we'll reset here so that this process can continue. So we're going to set this stuff aside briefly. So now I was kind of contemplating another possible approach here. So, you know, the one option is clearly to continue as we've been up until now with these horizontal migration approaches, trying to lure the worms into a feeding zone over on the edge. And just going back a little bit further, there was also another attempt, a couple attempts, that I had made using this box here where I had put in bedding and food, and the box sat down within the material, attempting to lure worms to it so that they could be baited and extracted. So I've already gone through numerous different attempts at getting worms out of this material. So besides having these bait boxes and then having the horizontal migration setups, it occurred to me that there was another approach that a lot of people recommend, which I've never really tried before. And it got me to thinking that, hey, maybe this would be a good opportunity to give it a try. So you know what? I think I'm going to give the old banana trick a try instead. So I think there's a couple benefits to this. Number one is going to be that I can use the entire surface here to spread the material out and to allow it to air out and dry out. So that should help speed along the drying process, because it's number one, greater surface area, and number two, the material is spread out more thinly across the surface of the tub. And I guess the other advantage is that I get to try something I've never tried yet. So I've got a frozen banana. I've got a number of frozen bananas in my refrigerator I've been setting aside for just this sort of a purpose, and finally I get to give it a try. So I'm just going to spread things out evenly across the entire surface of the container here, doing my best to crumble things up if I can along the way and level things off. But what I'm going to do now is, right in the middle, I'm just going to go ahead and excavate a little bit of a hole over here. And I guess we can even bring back from our excavated material, we can bring back this banana peel that we pulled out. So rather than moving it with the worms, we'll simply keep it in here. But in addition to that, we're also going to drop in a half of a frozen banana. The stem is on there. I cut this in half. Theoretically, this thing's going to be mobbed with worms by the time we check back in here next time. And I sure hope it works. So, I don't want that sitting out on the surface. I don't want that to become a magnet for all kinds of flying insects that could smell the scent of that banana. So I'm covering it up with castings. And I guess that also provides the worms with material in which to approach the banana from all directions. And even though I want this material to evaporate and dry, I'd still like to somehow cover this a little bit better so that no vapors, no smell of the banana will be emitted, so that insects can sense it and come in here. So even though I'd like the majority of the material to continue drying, I believe right over here I'm going to cover up. So I've got this fairly soiled piece of paper bag, and it seems to be about the right size. So I'm simply going to rest that right on top here. We'll go this way. And we're going to give this a try for a while. I'm not quite sure what to expect. I've heard a lot of positive things about trying this approach, so why not? Let's give it a go. So it's now 83 days, with numerous hauls of worms being removed from this bin. Over 10 times now I've removed small portions of worms, and this is number 12 attempt of baiting worms out of this material. So let's go see how many worms we can get out of that other tub. I'm going to go put this back on the shelf, and I'll be right back. Okay, once again, we've got plastic here. The purpose of the plastic is to not allow for evaporation, so that the moisture remains over here in the feeding area, to make the conditions here nice and damp and attractive for the worms, to try to get them to come over. And out here the material has been left to dry. And over the past 4 days now, 4 or 5 days maybe, I've been running a fan, blowing air continuously over the top of the surface of all of my bins. And I can definitely feel that it's making a pretty good difference because all the material right on the surface is quite dry and crumbly. And I know that right below the surface, the material is still retaining its moisture quite significantly, as castings do. This is one of the things that they're very well known for. But I think once we stir all this stuff together, this more dry, clumpy, dry, kind of hard material, once it gets mixed in with more damp stuff, it'll soften up. And you can see that the stuff is dry enough that it's not sticking to my glove whatsoever. It's almost all flaking right off. And I wonder if the material below the surface is the same way. And I'm also curious if we're going to find many worms in the material. If we're lucky, then the majority of them will be over here, and we'll find very few within the material itself. So let's start checking it out. As I make my way down, the material definitely has a greater amount of moisture to it, but it still crumbles pretty nicely. Perhaps a little bit better than what we found in that other tub. And I think once it mixes with this dry stuff on the surface, it should equalize into a pretty nice consistency. So far, I really don't know if I've seen any worms. I don't think I have. And I didn't really revisit the video of last time we checked in on this bin, so I can't recall what the state of things were in here offhand. Can't remember if there were still lots of worms or if we observed very few worms. But whatever it was last time, at this point it does seem like we're definitely approaching the end here. I don't see many worms or any worms in this material whatsoever, even down low in the more moist stuff. So I'm wondering if today is the day that we consider this as a done tub of castings. And then I guess that will also force the question at this point, and this is where I'll need to decide whether or not I'm going to treat this as a finished tub of castings, or if it's time to just start allowing it more time so that any cocoons that were left behind within the material are able to hatch, so that baby worms can emerge and that they can also be rounded up and relocated out of the castings. So I'm just trying to see if I can gauge how many cocoons I can see in the material as I stir it around. I'm attempting to sort of come up with a cutoff point here where the stuff over on this side is what I consider to be maybe finished castings, if we're in fact at that point. And if some of this more damp stuff on the edge has worms in it, then maybe those castings that are surrounding those worms can just be relocated into the new tub, and that would be fine as well. I mean, here and there I'm definitely spotting a worm. Here's one. What else do we have? Here's another one. So here and there it does seem like we've got a couple that are just sort of on the outskirts of the feeding zone. But not really that many if you think about it. This stuff is kind of damp, but if there's no worms in it, it can certainly stay with the finished castings. And once we mix it with the drier stuff, it should come up with a pretty nice consistency. So, decisions. What does one do in a case like this, you know? I mean, do I bless this as now a done worm bin after 113 days? This is a finished composting tub which has successfully been depopulated with all the worms migrated out and relocated? Or do I just give it more time now? Even though we've relocated all of the adult worms, do we go ahead and just start leaving it to become more and more dry and allowing time for any cocoons that might be in the material to hatch? And then we start observing baby worms emerging, also needing to be rounded up and extracted. I'm not sure what to do. If I do abandon my concept of finishing tubs, then this would just continue on. It wouldn't be a done tub of castings after 113 days. It would be a container that just continues its life cycle, just waiting for that next generation to emerge so that they too can be rounded up and kept within my population. So I don't know if it's so necessary for me to make that decision today. So I guess I could sleep on it. But I would love to hear everyone's comments and thoughts on the subject. You know, do you do that? Do you do that sort of finishing stage with your castings? Do you take it to this point and then just throw it in the garden, cocoons and all, knowing that baby worms are going to hatch, but they'll be out in your garden doing good? There's certainly no problem with doing that. Or do you think of it in terms of wanting to keep as many worms as possible within your population? So you keep the material around and you let worms hatch. I'd love to hear what other people do. I'm not sure if it's a topic we've gotten much into on my channel, so I'm definitely interested in hearing what other people do in their wormeries and in their worm farms. But let's not wait. Let's continue with what we started here. I'm just going to extract everything that I'm finding over here in this feeding zone, add it to these worms that we extracted from that finishing tub of mine. And then this stuff here too, maybe I'll just move that with everything else and consider that as additional bedding to add to my new bin as well. Can't think of what else to do with it. So I'm definitely curious to see what kind of a population we were able to get together on this go around. There's definitely a good mixture of bedding in here still, lots of dry leaves and everything mixed in. Even sticks that come along with the leaves, which probably would break down too in time, but I'm just going to pull that out. It definitely looks like we've got ourselves a pretty good number of worms that made their way out of the castings and into the feeding zone. Every chunk of material that I remove, I can tell it's populated quite densely with worms. When I had launched off my previous bin, I was really attempting in each haul of worms to do my best to separate the worms from the material that they were inhabiting so that I could put them on a scale and try estimating the numbers. I'm not going to do that. It was just sort of a one-time experiment that I was interested in trying, which I'd never done previously. But in my previous bin, I had estimated that I'd, over numerous hauls of worms out of a number of different bins, including these two that we worked on today, I came up with the rough estimate of approximately 5,000 worms that had been placed into that other bin of mine, which up until now was the newest of my bins. Now this is going to take over as the newest of my bins. So I'm wondering if there's anybody who would venture to guess how many worms we've successfully rounded up in this attempt, just from what we can see. It is rather difficult to tell because it's all kinds of castings material and food scraps and bedding and everything, along with the worms that are occupying it. So there's no really clear way to see what we've got here. I mean, maybe we can just rummage through this a little bit to see if it'll give us a slightly better view of what we ended up with. At this point, from the bright lights, you would have to imagine that the worms are trying to get away from the light and burrow down. So I'm going to try to stir it up a little bit so we can get a better view of what we've managed to round up here out of these two tubs. So what do you think? What do we got here? To me, it seems like we've probably got at least 1,000 worms. If it was worms only, I would have to guess that it's probably somewhere around a pound. Because in pounds, you would normally equate 1,000 red wiggler worms to 1 pound of weight on a scale. And, hey Siri, how many kilograms is 1 pound?
1 pound is 0.45 kilograms.
So if you think that we've got maybe 0.45 kilograms worth of worms here, then that would equate to about 1,000 worms. And I think that's a fair estimate. So I don't think I'm going to go crazy trying to keep track of these numbers, but I'm always curious to see if it's possible to estimate how many worms I'm moving at any given time. So why don't we set these little guys aside, and we'll try to figure out what to do with this. I guess it probably does make sense to give this material time to air out and dry. And then at some point, I'm sure probably in the near future, I'll begin observing baby worms starting to show up in this material. I'd be surprised if it didn't happen, to tell you the truth. But what I'm surprised at is that I'm not observing tons and tons of cocoons throughout the material. And a lot of times I'll just attest that to myself, you know. I don't think I've got the best vision in the world. And I probably don't have the best lighting either here. But I do recall some instances where I've taken an extracted batch of compost like this and let it sit and sit and sit for quite some time and never observed any baby worms emerging from it. So it would just seem odd to me to think that this material, for whatever reason, is devoid of any cocoons, while, you know, other material in my wormery clearly has abundant numbers of cocoons in it. So maybe it would make good sense for me to spend a little bit of time poking through this a little bit more carefully. Just trying to see if, you know, maybe there are worm cocoons in here, and whether there's still some potential for hatchlings to begin emerging from this. It's the one weird thing about vermicomposting is the inconsistencies that you see sometimes from bin to bin. A lot of times you think that you've got things dialed in pretty good, where everything's being managed in a fairly consistent fashion, but then certain results differ so much that it makes you scratch your head and wonder why. Based on my old system of record keeping, I believe that it is time to consider this as a tub of finished compost. It's been successfully depopulated of worms using the horizontal migration method. So I'm going to mark it off as done. What I end up doing with the material in the tub is still yet to be decided. If need be, I guess I could always sort of change its status from being done to still being in a sort of a finishing stage. And maybe that is what I'll do. Maybe that's just another stage of the life cycle, and that it might be a little bit premature to consider this as really being done if the objective is to allow time for the babies to emerge from the cocoons that are assumed to be in the material, and then eventually round them up and exclude them from the material too. And there again, it's really a matter of what you're after. If what you're after is compost that could be used right away in the garden, then this is where you're at. This is the stuff you would want to use in your garden. If you wanted stuff that was nice and dry, stuff that could be run through a sifter, so that what you're left with is really fine material, then maybe what you need is a little bit of time to let this stuff dry out. And if nothing else, then I believe that that's what this is going to do for the next week or two, until such a time that it all crumbles loosely in my hands and can all run through a sifter easily. If I wanted to sift it and remove any little particles of remaining food or bedding that might still be in here, then it would have to be much finer for that to happen easily. So So let's not ponder this any further. I'm going to put it back up on the shelf, and I'll flip a coin later and decide what to do next. What I want to do now is get the new bin out here and launch the worms. Start off our new bin. It's always surprising when you grab a brand new bin that's about to be launched. You wonder, how can it be so light? It's amazing. I compare it to a finished tub of castings, which is quite heavy. I've got kind of a regular basic setup here. I'm trying something that's somewhat new here. I've been not only covering up with this piece of cardboard, but the cardboard is wrapped in plastic. So I've got that happening on my other bin too, my other newest bin. The material in here, most of the bedding is shredded paper, shredded white paper. You can see a little bit of it peeking through there, as well as leaves, as well as dry leaves. I took some old castings material, which I know is teeming with microbes and bacteria and whatever, all the vital ingredients needed to get a good healthy bin off to a good start. So hopefully all those microbes that have been resting in here have made their way down into the food that was added. The food was just a variety of different shredded small particles of food scattered throughout the bin. Not a great deal of food, but just enough to hopefully get them started. The material that they're coming over with is also going to be rich in food from the feeding zone that they were occupying, as well as the food that's in here, and the bedding is all edible too. And then the plastic covering things up here will help recirculate the moisture and keep things throughout the bin nice and cozy, hopefully, making for a nice comfortable environment for the worms. So let's bring over the container here. There was a fair bit of recycled bedding here, scraps of cardboard, scraps of paper, and leaves that we can bring over. But we've also got the huge mound of worms and the castings and material that they occupy. So a lot of times my worm releases are pretty exciting because I do go to the extra effort of trying to remove the worms from the material that they're inhabiting. But in this case, I think it would be just a little bit too difficult for that to happen. So I'm just going to go ahead and move all this right into the container, and maybe we'll see some worms, maybe it won't be that much of a spectacle, but it doesn't matter. Either way, I think we're launching off a quantity of about 1,000 worms here. And maybe if we stir it around a little bit to even things out, we'll get a better view of how many we managed to round up here. It's a collection of baby worms removed from the finishing tub, as well as mature worms removed from the active worm bin. You could definitely see scraps of food and bedding in here that were brought over with the worms. So I'm going to see if I can scrape out whatever remains in this tub so I don't leave any worms behind. As far as I could tell, we've got them all. Good job. And I'm going to give these little guys a chance to squirm down and get acclimated into the new space. I don't think it's going to take too long. So I think that's it. We've got ourselves a new worm bin. I guess I'll just cover things up here and onto the edge of the bin, following tradition. I'm going to put on the sticker that makes it official. Please help me welcome the newest of my worm bins to my wormery. Now, like I mentioned, I've got that other bin that used to be the newest of my bins over there, the one that had 5,000 worms launched into it. So now this bin with only 1,000 worms in it could probably use some additional worms. So the worms that I've got lined up to go into that container eventually are worms that are presently in this bin right here and this one right here. Now I visited in on those two bins. They've been sitting out here for 15 days now since the last time they were fed. They're just being given time to let the material dry out and let the worms work down the material, whatever remains in there, bedding, food, and stuff like that. And then in those bins I'll begin the process of trying to migrate worms out. And as we do, they'll be making their way into the newest of my bins. So that's it today. We're done. I'm glad you were here to keep me company. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.